Hello and welcome to The Close Read, a production of the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Assistant Editor Spencer Clavin, and I will be diving every episode into an essay or review from the latest issue of the Claremont Review of Books, the gold standard in conservative thought and political philosophy. Each time we publish an issue, I will sit down with a few authors and dig deeper into the themes and ideas that motivated their writing. Thanks for joining us. Let's get started. It is my distinct pleasure today to welcome Professor John Ellis. He's the Professor Emeritus of German Literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's the chairman of the California Association of Scholars, and he's the author of the book, The Breakdown of Higher Education, which is available on Amazon and probably wherever you get your books. He's written an essay for this issue entitled College After COVID, which is a fairly descriptive title. It tells you what the subject is. It's some meditations, really, I think, thought-provoking reflections on what the increase of online learning and the transition both into and then out of coronavirus lockdowns could potentially do to our admittedly quite defunct, or even you might say highly politicized university system. And so I'll just read a section from the opening of this essay before I get to chatting with John here. In 2011, the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center recorded a total enrollment in all sectors of higher education of slightly over 20.5 million students, writes John. 8 years later, in 2019, total enrollment was slightly over 17.5 million students. But in those 8 years, the U.S. population had grown from 311.6 million to 328.2 million. Had the percentage of total population in higher education remained constant, that 5.3% population increase would have grown the 2011 figure to 21.65 million students by 2019, which means that there are roughly 4 million students missing in the 2019 figures, a decline of about 19%. The decline has been steady over those 8 years, but the 2019 shortfall is on the high end of the annual declines. The general picture that emerges from the overall enrollment numbers is that public opinion is uncertain, with most families continuing to come down on the side of their old habit of sending their children to college, but with a sizable minority refusing to continue to pay up and hope for the best. If we look at the two major factors that are pulling the public in opposite directions, however, it's clear that one is older and steadily weakening, while the other is newer and strengthening. With the great days of elite institutions receding into the past, radical left-wing ranting is becoming more visible as older professors retire and are replaced by younger, more politicized ones. Professor Ellis, I want to get in a moment to some of your comments about coronavirus lockdowns specifically, but these statistics and these trends that you identify quite predate coronavirus and predate the effects that COVID lockdowns have had on higher education. I was wondering, that you cite two things, the precipitous drop in confidence in higher education, but then the sort of more important statistic of actual enrollment declines, people actually taking action on their loss of confidence. In your either experience or in your research, what is it that makes the difference between those two things, between parents thinking, well, I don't feel great about what's being taught at universities, and then actually making the choice not to send their kids to college or to seek alternative modes of education?
Well, I think there are an awful lot of factors involved. One of them is financial. I mean, first of all, the COVID event has meant that money is in shorter supply for a good number of people. And obviously, with money in short supply, the uses of that money are going to be scrutinized more carefully. So that's certainly one factor. But there's also the general background of the sheer volume, the number of stories of politicized classrooms, of students that come home from a couple of years in college, less inclined to think intelligently and freely, seemingly more in the grip of very rigid ideologies that are very difficult to defend. So parents see these two things. I mean, they have less money to spend. They see that the product for higher education is being dubious.
Right.
And so hence the decline. The question we're now facing is that decline going to go on? And of course, we can't measure it in the same way now because COVID has so changed everything. It'll take the end of COVID, getting back to a normal cycle of the annual cycle of universities. Then we can measure what the decline has been. My suspicion is the decline will have accelerated because of COVID. And the decline I described in those numbers is 19%. And I give reasons why that does not present an obvious emergency to the public, mainly because the most visible schools don't see their enrollment affected very much. I mentioned that University of California had its freshman enrollment applications decline in 2 years, decline 5%, which is a very big decline for 2 years with an increasing population. But the University of California went ahead anyway and simply admitted, dug deeper into its applicant pool. Now, you can only go on doing that for so long. My sense is this. I just have a gut feeling that when that 19% decline reaches 30%, which it could well do after COVID, then you'll start to see obvious signs of distress in particular institutions. You'll see bankruptcies and closing downs of campuses. And that will probably create a lot more public discussion of why it's happening.
Right. No, that's intriguing. And I found that sort of observation that particularly prestigious and visible universities can simply dig deeper into their applicant pool. That's a remarkable fact and hides a lot of the decline, as you note. It speaks also to a dimension of this which does fascinate me, and that is prestige and cultural cachet. It seems that those kind of intangible attributes of universities are some of the most resistant to actual change. And as you get further into the essay, you start suggesting ways in which online learning can come to fill the gap that universities will be leaving. And one question I had is, do you think that that online centers of learning will face a prestige hurdle? Something, will it be difficult for them to really attract students as, the top-notch thing that they can do, if you see what I mean?
Well, that's a very key question. I mean, you've got the opposing forces. You've got the prestige factor, which will always guarantee that Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and so on have sufficient applications. Now, the question is, how far down the system does that go? It probably goes as far as the University of California. Does it go as far as the California State University system? Probably not. But in any case, the opposing force of the public seeing the overt results on campus. I mean, it so happens at the moment, the most prestigious campus of the University of California, which is Berkeley, is the one most prone to riots. And quite honestly, it's the most politicized campus, I think, of all of them. So Berkeley is essentially busy destroying its own prestige. And over time, the prestige factor will recede as the public has a memory, but it doesn't last forever.
Right.
You will get slowly a situation where the obvious foolishness and intolerance of the Berkeley campus starts to blot out the memory of the prestige. How long it's going to take? I don't know. We're spectators. We're analysts, but also we're people waiting to see what happens.
Sure.
how the public responds. One thing is certain is the public is responding. Those numbers, the decline, do show that. And just what kind of response, how quickly it will happen, we're going to see.
Are we in a bit of a race against time in this regard? One of my concerns is, and this I think was shown in the riots of the past summer and some of the kind of more ostensibly radical ideologies that suddenly took a very central place in American life, that one narrative that emerged from that as well, kids that went to these highly politicized campuses didn't just grow up and mature, they actually became true believers in the ideology they were taught. And it strikes me that eventually those people are going to be the ones choosing whether to send their kids to university and which one. So do you see that what I'm saying, that those folks might not actually mind sending their kids to a politicized university? Or do you think that will be a negligible factor in this development?
Well, first of all, I mean, people argue about what the effect of politicized professors is, in fact. I mean, some people say kids can see through them and laugh at them.
Right.
But the real question, of course, is we're not talking about 100% of students. We're talking about what percentage of students become true believers. Now, my belief is that the political climate of the nation shows that an appreciable number become true believers. It's possible that most kids just laugh at politicized professors' foolishness. But even that, even if it's most, that would still leave us with possibly 30, 40% of students who go out into society bearing this very destructive radical left ideology. It's very strong ties to Marxism, even if it isn't overtly Marxist. But it is destructive of the social order. It is contemptuous of the Constitution, contemptuous of all those strengths built in by the founding fathers to our political life, all the lessons that were the political lessons of the ages that were built into the Constitution. If a third of students coming out of college are contemptuous of all that achievement, that's a very serious thing for the nation.
Indeed.
Now, surveys of young people under 30 do show an extraordinary number have a favorable view of socialism. Now, one can be skeptical of what they really understand when they say that, whether they really understand what they're talking about. But there's no doubt that a significant number really do mean socialism,
right.
Real socialism. And again, we're talking about just percentages. If even 20% of college kids come out with essentially a Marxist worldview, that's still a very serious thing. My sense is it's probably greater than that. It's great enough to have caused a serious shift in the political life of the nation. I mean, there is at the moment a tolerance for, say, the philosophy of Bernie Sanders.
Indeed.
That was not there 10 years ago. Certainly was not there 10 years. Bernie was a buffoon in the eyes of most people 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. Now he's part of our mainstream.
Right. That's
what the politicized campus has achieved for us. And it's very dangerous because with each graduating class, the numbers in Bernie's camp increase.
Right.
So we must do something about this. This is a national emergency. You cannot have your educational system taken over by radical leftists and expect your society to survive intact indefinitely. It won't. My feeling is that the general public essentially has to eventually throw off the spell of the prestige, the ancient prestige of universities, and face the reality that what is going on is not helpful.
Right.
It's not the wonderful thing for society it used to be, but instead a very, very dangerous influence.
Well, thank you for ringing that alarm bell. It's one that we try to ring as often as possible, as loudly as possible at Claremont, and it increases, I think, the urgency of some of the considerations you get into in the latter half of your essay, having to do with, what are the obstacles to online learning genuinely presenting itself as an alternative to our more, shall we say, venerable, or at least apparently venerable universities, one of which is the sort of lack of social experience, the fact that kids can't convene, and you propose establishing, centers where people taking the same online courses can meet up and can socialize and discuss ideas and do all of the things that people do at universities that they get out of the experience that's not just a credential. Now, one just remarkable feature of that, it seems to me that it has the potential really to localize American life again. I mean, I'm somebody who moved across country to go to a specific university. And I think many people now look at least the whole US and in some cases the whole world as their, potential playing field for choosing the best place for them. It seems like there's less of a need for that if what you're doing is just meeting up with the people in your area who take the same courses. Is that a fair assessment, or do you think people will still travel as part of this kind of new online regime that you suggest?
Yes, I think you're right. This will, in a way, contribute to sort of regional pride. And I was raised in a country, England,
Sure.
which was extremely centralized. I mean, London was where the central activity was. A few satellites like Oxford and Cambridge, which were, culturally suburbs of London, really. If you were born in Yorkshire and you wanted to count, you had to go to London.
Sure.
Now, one thing I noticed about North America the minute I came here was that was not the case. There was a pride of Californians in the University of California that was not present in England. I mean, I taught at the University of Leicester. Almost all the faculty at the University of Leicester really wanted to be somewhere else. They wanted to be in London. They wanted to be in London.
Right.
One thing I noticed when I came here, and it's true in Canada too, I was at the University of Alberta for a while. Albertans were proud of their local university. And people who taught at the University of Alberta were proud of being there. And I saw the same thing in California. So I think regional centers promoting regional pride again is a positive force. The whole ethos of America, I think, is that local control of institutions is a very useful phenomenon.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a kind of appealing, and in some ways, I think in the States we have almost call it a fantasy or an ideal of this, of the small local schoolhouse expanding outward into the, and you're right. I mean, I did my graduate work in the UK and had I noticed something similar, that there's really only a few games in town, essentially. I want to talk about a proposition that you mentioned at the very end of your essay. It goes beyond a little bit I should say that the other challenge you identify for our listeners is credential, the creation of credentials and credentializing, which is really established in in-person universities and will need to be somehow formulated in an analogous way for online. But then you say that there's another set of propositions that need attending to, one of which is for state legislatures to revoke funding that's designated for education, but it's really going to indoctrination. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what the details of that might look like. I think, I can see a lot of objections that would arise unless it was done in a very principled way. How do you think it would be good for legislators to go about identifying what that funding is, which funding is going to politics when it should be going to education?
Well, I think, first of all, it can only happen in states that have conservative legislatures because, unfortunately, there's this phenomenon we've known about forever, which is that liberals think the left are their friends,
Right.
conservatives their enemies.
Right.
In point of fact, when you think of the kind of way of life they really want, it's the other way around. The left are their enemies and the conservatives are their friends. But unfortunately, it's a fact of life that you're only going to get this kind of activity in a conservative legislature. And I think a conservative legislature ought to say to a campus, say the University of Kansas or Nebraska, how can you justify a political science department teaching political science, giving a PhD in political science, when you don't have a single right of center figure on your teaching faculty? How can you justify that? Explain to me why that's sufficient education. Explain to me what the motivation is for your doing that. How did you wind up with that? And I think legislatures should start to talk to universities, ask them to explain themselves, put to them what would seem to the layman to be a reasonable way of organizing a teaching faculty for political science, and ask them what their rationale is for what they're doing. And if they don't like that rationale, they should simply say to those campuses, you must change, or you must fly on your own funding that you find from somewhere else, but not from the citizens of this state. The other thing, of course, that it's very possible for state legislatures to say is that the founding documents of almost every state university, there's going to be a legislation that set up the state university. There is in California. It forbids political motivation. It forbids political activity as part of the educational process. Again, the legislature should say to state universities, your charter says this, but you do that. Now, why is that? So there's a lot of preparatory work that can be done in just setting up commissions of inquiry, putting direct questions to campuses as to why they're doing what they're doing and what their motivation is. And by the time you've got answers to those questions and maybe having a report of commissions of distinguished elders set up, you have a basis for defunding universities or giving them ultimatums, telling them that if they don't have a political science department that meets certain elementary standards that any high school kid can understand, then they'll be defunded.
It strikes me that we saw a somewhat analogous approach to the one you're outlining on the floor of Parliament not too long ago. I think it was the Secretary of Education who discussed critical race theory as this, as a sort of flatly illegal thing to teach in a British publicly funded university. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the climate among educators. Beyond yourself, you are somebody that not only has a distinguished career in education, but you also, I think, have your finger on the pulse of kind of a broader array of people that are doing this teaching online, folks that are thinking about how to reopen and what the world will look like post reopening, and what you say to me here in this interview seems perfectly self-evident in some sense, in that the common sense of it is apparent, and the unsustainability of the situations that you identify when you lay them out as you do strike me as quite plain. I wonder whether your sense is that there's a groundswell of interest in alternatives among educators, alternative forms of education, or whether there's resistance to the idea, say, of online learning as a kind of permanent thing that's here to stay post-COVID.
Are you talking about opinion among academics or on the general public?
No, I'm interested in specifically in academics, how they're reacting.
Well, I'm afraid that academia at one time had a pretty vigorous debate on campus but this was many years ago, about which way it wanted to go and so on. So 30 years ago, people like me were writing books that were addressed to not the public, but their colleagues, saying basically, we shouldn't be doing the following things. We shouldn't be following Derrida and deconstruction because it's nonsense.
Right.
We shouldn't be allowing feminism to introduce politics into our curriculum, political motivation. But that stage is long since over. I mean, we have gone from a situation where in 1969, which is now 50 years ago, there were 3 left-of-center professors for every 2 right-of-center professors.
Wow.
We've gone from that in 50 years to a time when we're now at something like 13 to 1, 13 left-of-center to 1 right-of-center. And the 1 right-of-center is pretty intimidated in most places and shuts his mouth anyway. So we don't have a debate on campus. If I were to go and deliver a lecture on campus with the attitudes you've heard me express,
sure,
I would be shouted down. I think I can say that with almost absolute certainty.
Yeah.
So one can't diagnose any kind of level of interest on campus in reform because the campuses have emptied themselves out of people who think differently. There's now a tremendous uniformity of opinion. Now, there are some islands, and you represent one of them. I mean, the Claremont McKenna Political Science Department is very unusual. It still has a vigorous debate going on. It would be wonderful if that were replicated elsewhere. You probably know better than I how many such places there are in the academy, but I suspect not very many. On my campus, there's not a single right-of-center political science professor.
Wow. Well,
so the only development of opinion, so to speak, groundswell, will be with the general public.
Right.
The question facing us now is, can the general public, which is supposedly served by academia, can the general public assert its will and say to academia, in effect, you are not doing what we created you to do. We insist you change or we'll defund you. That's the only avenue of change I see now.
Well, it's my sincerest hope that the answer to that question is yes. And I'm encouraged somewhat by the thought that if universities are chasing all of that talent off of their campus, it has to be going somewhere. And surely the kinds of rebuilding that you outline in this essay is possible with that talent. Professor John Ellis, it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you for joining us. If our listeners have not already, they should take a look at the fall 2020 issue of the Claremont Review of Books and find Professor Ellis's essay, College After COVID. This has been another episode of The Close Read. Thank you all for listening.